What's up, guys? So this is going to be a video for the real boxing nerds. You have to be a diehard to want to watch this video, but maybe some of you casual fans will find it interesting. I don't know. Some of you are going to cringe when you hear what I'm about to talk about. The sanctioning bodies. I'm going to talk about the history, where they come from, which ones came first, all that good stuff. Some of you have asked me for this for a while. It's kind of been in the queue. I've had a few different projects I was working on, and I just had some time now to be able to get to this one. So buckle up, get ready for the excitement of the sanctioning organization history. Seriously though, look, if you're a diehard fight fan and you're a boxing nerd, I do think you'll find some of this interesting. And you know, some of this information, it does give some perspective to the different titles and what they mean. Some people hate the sanctioning organizations. My personal philosophy is that they're a necessary evil. You guys know, if you follow my channel, you know how I feel about boxing being so global. You can't have one entity run the show. You can't have one promoter or even one sanctioning organization run the show. You kind of need all four of them. Now, do I wish all four of them would work together more often? Of course. But other than that, you kind of need them. So without further ado, let's get into this, okay? Now, the first, and I'm talking about the four major sanctioning organizations, WBA, WBC, IBF, WBO, obviously. There's a few other ones out there, but those are the four major ones. And really, two of them are the classic ones. So we'll start with the oldest sanctioning body, and that's the World Boxing Association, the WBA, which actually historically was the NBA, not the National Basketball Association, the National Boxing Association. That was founded back in 1921 in the USA. So the roots of the WBA go back to the NBA, go back to America, right? And now, of course, it's in Latin America. More on that in a second. So this is back when boxing, again, this is 1921. This is back when boxing was really Northeastern America, primarily New York based. It was almost seen as a New York sport, but there were other entities, right? But the New York State Athletic Commission was kind of seen as the overhead of boxing, of professional boxing at that time. They had their own champions. They named the world champion, right? And there was some corruption in the New York State Athletic Commission, particularly with La Cosa Nostra and some of the things that were going on at that time, even the politicians in New York. So the NBA, the National Boxing Association, was created to counterbalance the influence of the NYSAC. And originally, when they started, they didn't even collect sanctioning fees. The NBA, imagine, okay, think of the WBA now, and you go back to their roots, they didn't collect sanctioning fees. Imagine that shit. It's true. So they once were basically created to kind of keep an eye on the New York State Athletic Commission and to pose, I guess, just another voice, an opposing voice, because a lot of people just didn't agree with what the New York State Athletic Commission was doing, the champions they were granting. This is back in the day where there were newspaper decisions and there were conflicting reports about the outcome of fights. There was no box rec, right? So a lot of people felt that, well, fighters from the Midwest, from the West Coast, from the South, from other countries weren't getting a fair shake, and that fighters from the New York area or just the Northeast of the United States in general were getting preferential treatment. So that was the beginning of the NBA, which became the WBA. So their first champion, the first bout that they sanctioned was the heavyweight title fight for their vacant title between Jack Dempsey and George Carpentier. I'm probably butchering that name. It looks like Carpenter, but Carpentier. In New Jersey. That was July 2nd, 1921 in New Jersey. That was for their vacant heavyweight title. That was the very first bout sanctioned by one of the four major sanctioning bodies as we know them today. Okay? Now, in 1962, the NBA changed their name to the WBA, to the World Boxing Association, as boxing began to globalize. Through the 40s and 50s, it was still heavily American sport, but it started to spread out into cities like Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia had a bunch of fighters, right? You started to have some fighters from the Midwest, from the West Coast. So the influence of boxing was spreading, but it was still an American thing. But you started to have fighters from Latin America, from Europe coming over and being successful. Boxing was starting to globalize. So again, 1962, they changed it from the National to the World Boxing Association. And in fact, they moved their headquarters to Panama in 1975. So you think about the WBA, the first 40 plus years of its existence, it was in the United States, the headquarters, and then they moved to Panama in the mid-70s. They briefly moved their location to Caracas, Venezuela in the late 90s, early 2000s for political reasons, and then they ended up returning to Panama in 2007. That's where they're headquartered now. They're still in Panama today. So Gilberto Mendoza is a Venezuelan, became president in 1982. He's the one who moved it to Caracas in the late 90s. He was president up until his death in 2016, just last year. And then his son, Gilberto Jr., took over. You find this as a theme with the two older sanctioning organizations. They're kind of family-run institutions. And people have accused them of being run like mafia institutions. You know, I talked about La Cosa Nostra earlier. Some people say it's almost run like Hollywood, like a Hollywood studio. And I've heard people comparing it to the Clintons and the Bushes, you know, just the Kennedys. Very, very, you know, nepotism. Just very, I guess, top controlled. And the influence stays with one family through generations. And that's what you have with the WBA here currently. Although Gilberto Jr., I think he's done a pretty good job so far. They could do light years better. But compared to what his father was doing and some of the madness with all the different titles and stuff, Gilberto Jr. seems to be doing a little bit better so far. And they just instituted a drug testing program. Details are still a little, and it's not as good as the WBC's, but we'll talk about all that later. So a couple of little factoids about the WBA. They were the first to recognize a junior middleweight champion back in 1962, and they basically created the cruiserweight division as well back in 1979. That's back when it was 190 pounds. It became 200 pounds, hell, probably 10, 15 years ago. So they basically created, as we know them today, the junior middleweight division and the cruiserweight division. So those are two loaded divisions. Thank the WBA for that, believe it or not. Current number of champions, I will get into that later, and I'm going to do a comparison of the different sanctioning organizations and how many champions they have, and I'll talk to you about just my general feel about them, which ones I like better than others, okay? So let's get into the World Boxing Council, the WBC. They were founded in 1963. This was a year after the WBA changed their name to the World Boxing Association, right? So these guys, as boxing was globalizing, you had the NBA become the WBA, and you had the WBC just come into creation. So in 1983, after the death of Dooku Kim, you guys know the fight between Ray Mancini and Dooku Kim, where the brave Korean fighter ended up dying. The WBC changed their championship fights from 15 rounds to 12. So the WBC was the first of the sanctioning organizations to institute that rule, and all the other ones followed suit after that. So the 12-round championship fights, whether you love them or you hate them, you can thank or blame the WBC for that one. Jose Sulaiman became president in 1975 until his death in 2014. And of course, his son Mauricio took over at that point. So again, you have nepotism. You have a family-run organization. It's almost run like the Lucchese's and the Genovese and the Gambinos, right? It almost has that kind of feel to it sometimes. It just gets passed down to the son. So some people like that. Some people hate that. Now, Mauricio compared to Jose. I do like some of the things Mauricio Sulaiman's done, particularly with the clean boxing program. I love that. I think that's the best thing the WBC has going right now. There's some things about the WBC I just don't like, though, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So here's the thing about the WBC. It has members from 161 different countries. And when it was founded back in 1963, it started with 11 countries. So they have kind of always been the most global, the most international, at least on paper, institution. of the 4 sanctioning bodies. They've been the most globally represented, quote unquote. But there's some controversy with that because of those 11 countries when they first started out, 8 of them were in Latin America. So it's not like they had countries in Asia and Africa and Europe. And, it's been heavily Latin American based. And of course, it's headquartered in Mexico. And the WBC is notoriously linked to example after example of favoring Mexican fighters. Not just Mexican fighters, though. I could say they very, very often favor star fighters, regardless of what country they're from. But there have been tons of examples where they favor Mexican fighters. They're based out of Mexico City. So it kind of goes without saying. They created the Diamond Championship in 2009, the Silver title in 2010. They've given out special International, Eternal, Emeritus, Supreme, and Hochul championships over the years. So they have a zillion different versions of their belts, as the WBA does as well. The WBA and the WBC are the classic 2 sanctioning organizations that go back each over 50 years. I mean, the WBA is almost 100 years old. The WBC is now over 50 years old. So they're the 2 classic. And I guess since they've been around the longest, they have the most titles and the most different kinds of titles. I guess it just kind of goes with the territory. Now, WBC, I talked about, they've been accused of favoring star fighters or any fighters that are of Mexican heritage or from Mexico. But they've also been accused of bending the rules for powerful promoters, particularly Don King. Don Jose Sulaiman, back in the day, had a very cozy relationship with Don King, who was one of the most powerful promoters at the time. You go back to 70s and 80s. And even Al Heyman, today, you look at Mauricio Sulaiman, there's a comfortable relationship there with Al Heyman and the PBC. A lot of Al Heyman's titleists have WBC titles. So there's a comfortable relationship there. But I'm not going to talk too much about this case. You guys go back, Google this. Google the case between Roy Jones Jr. and Graziano Rocchigiani back in 1998. So Rocchigiani, well, this is back when Jones moved up in weight. And he left his light heavyweight title, moved up in weight to fight, I think it was John Ruiz, yeah. And he won the title, came back down and decided, you know what, I want my title back. I don't want to fight at heavyweight. Can you just give me my title? Now, Rocchigiani had won, I think, a vacant version of the title or something like that. I'm just going off the top of my head here. So he sued the WBC because he said, and the WBC sided with Roy Jones. They're like, yeah, here you go. You're Roy freaking Jones. This other guy here, who's an Italian guy based in Germany, nobody knows about him. Who cares about him? They clearly bent their rules. They bent, I believe it was over a dozen of their rules. And each sanctioning organization has a book this fucking thick. It's like the tax code of all their protocol, right? And the lawyers, because Rocchigiani sued the WBC in the late 90s, they found, I believe, don't quote me, but I believe it was over a dozen violations of the WBC's own rules in them favoring Roy Jones in this case. So anyway, he sued for $30 million and won in the lawsuit. The judge, the jury, whatever, they sided with Rocchigiani. And as such, the WBC filed bankruptcy. They were broke. They were finished. The WBC would have been done, except a bunch of boxing insiders, fighters, tons of people in the boxing community went to Rocchigiani and said, look, man, can you find a way? Can you settle with these guys? Can you find a compromise so that they can stay in business? And ultimately, he did, maybe it's the right thing. You might think it's the right thing. You might think it's the wrong thing. But I think most people in the boxing community feel it was the right thing to do because I don't know if this was worth $30 million. He settled out of court for a 6-figure settlement so that the WBC could stay in business. Now, I think it should have been more than 6 figures. It should have been 7 figures. But ultimately, all of you who are WBC fans and fans of a WBC champion right now, thank Mr. Graziano Rocchigiani for settling out of court. This dude was due $30 million and he settled out of court for 6 figures so the WBC could stay in business. All right, so a couple little factoids about the BC. They were the first to recognize a junior flyweight champion back in 1975. So they essentially created the 108-pound weight class. They were the first to sanction a championship fight for super flyweight, 115 pounds, and super bantamweight, 122 pounds. So the super flyweight, their first championship fight there was in 1980, and that's a loaded division right now. So smart move by the WBC. And super bantamweight, their first champion there was in 1976. So they kind of created the 108, 115, 122 pound weight class. And then I talked about the clean boxing program. I've talked about that in a bunch of videos. I'm not going to go into details there, but I like the clean boxing program. I think it's a good thing. And I do think that the WBC, when it comes to drug testing, is leading the way. There are plenty of flaws in the clean boxing program. It could be way, way better. Most of the issue comes down to budget. I think budget is the biggest issue. They could dedicate more money toward it. But if the other sanctioning bodies aren't even doing that much, the WBC is still far ahead in that regard. You have to give them that much. Okay, so let's get on to the International Boxing Federation, the IBF, which was founded in 1983 by Bob Lee, who was the president of the USBA, which is a regional sanctioning organization here in the United States. And he basically created the IBF because he felt the WBA, the WBC were against American fighters. So it was kind of to counteract what they were doing and have an American sanctioning organization. And in fact, the IBF is the only of the 4 major sanctioning organizations to be headquartered in the United States. So Bob Lee, again, he was the president of the USBA at the time. He ran to be the WBA president at the WBA convention in 1983, or maybe it was 1982, but he failed, right? And I think it was, Mendoza was the president, and he just won re-election every year. Every time it was up for election, he won, right? So Bob Lee was kind of furious at that. He felt that it was kind of insider trading almost, the way it was being run, mafioso kind of being run like that. So he made his own organization, the IBF, which is headquartered in New Jersey. And look, when it first came out, a lot of people laughed at it. They considered it a joke. They did not recognize it at all. And they first gained legitimacy when they recognized Larry Holmes, Aaron Pryor, Marvin Hagler, Donald Curry, fighters like that as their champion. So they intelligently sanctioned vacant titles and stuff for those star fighters, all American fighters. You see a pattern here? Holmes, Pryor, Hagler, Curry. So they were American fighters, American stars. So then the American boxing publications started to take note of that and started to recognize the IBF because a lot of people felt, again, that the WBC, WBA weren't doing some of the American stars any favors at that time. So Bob Lee resigned as president in 1999 after being convicted for racketeering charges. He was taking bribes to rate fighters. So as much as he was fighting the man when he created the IBF to counterbalance some of the corruption that was going on in the WBA and WBC, and there's been decades of it, the IBF was guilty of corruption as well. And again, I'll keep going back to the La Cosa Nostra comparison here. You had racketeering charges. Literally, the president of the IBF was busted on racketeering charges. So he resigned as president, and there's been a couple different presidents since, but one interesting fact about the IBF, the only sanctioning body to have a female president. Hiawatha Knight, I believe, was the first female sanctioning body president. She ended up taking over for a while. Then there was Marian Muhammad. Now it's Daryl Peoples. He's the current president. So the IBF was the first to recognize a minimum weight champion in June 1987. And they were the first to recognize a super middleweight champion in 1984. So they created the 105-pound and 168-pound weight classes as we know them today. Last but not least, or maybe they are least, depending on where you sit on the fence on this one. World Boxing Organization, the WBO. They were founded in 1988, only 5 years after the IBF. And they were basically founded by a group of Puerto Rican and Dominican, I think, lawyers or business investor type people who went to the WBA's annual convention in Venezuela in 1988, and they basically did not like the WBA's rules. They didn't like the way the WBA was doing business. They said this is bullshit, and they stormed out in the middle of the convention and ended up creating their own thing. They said, screw this, we're doing our own thing. So when they first started, they said, we're going to be a non-profit organization. That's literally how they marketed the WBO. We're a non-profit institution. I'm just going to leave that alone. So Puerto Rican lawyer Francisco Valcarcel became president in 1996, and he's still the president now. You have these long-reigning presidents in these sanctioning groups, people that literally run these organizations for decades. It's hard to find any other commissioner in sports, think about this, that controls a union or something like that for decades. That generally doesn't happen. Very, very common with boxing sanctioning organizations. So Valcarcel's been president since 1996, much like the IBF, even more so, I think. They struggled to gain credibility at first. Their first heavyweight champ, here the WBO screwed up, where the IBF was smart and they sanctioned championship bouts to guys like Holmes and Hagler. The first WBO heavyweight champ was Francesco Damiani. This was while Mike Tyson was the heavyweight champ of the other three groups. Okay, think about that for a second. So BC, and IBF have Mike Tyson as the heavyweight champ. The WBO, the new kids on the block, their heavyweight champ is Francesco Damiani. So not smart. And in fact, the Ring magazine, who, if you look at the Ring ratings, they traditionally will list, which belt. If a ranked fighter has one or more of the belts, they usually list them in parentheses. I know several boxing publications do that, right? They didn't even recognize these guys at first. That's how much of a joke they were. And again, Mike Tyson's the heavyweight champ of the world, Francesco Damiani. You're not going to win any favors. You're not going to win any fans if that's the way you're doing business. Now, although the WBO didn't really have recognition here in the USA, they gained recognition over in Europe because a lot of their first champions and their good champions were European. You think of guys like Chris Eubank, Nassim Hamed, Nigel Benn, Joe Calzaghe, Vitaly and Vladimir Klitschko. Now, some of those guys turned out to be all-time greats. So they started to build up their profile with these European quote-unquote champions as the European fighters, particularly a lot of British fighters, a lot of UK fighters, and a lot of the Eastern European fighters began really, really taking over the sport and having a major, major influence as boxing, again, became even more globalized. You know, I talked earlier in this video about how boxing first started to become globalized, back in the 50s and 60s and when the WBA was around and all this stuff. In the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, it expanded even bigger because the Latin American expansion had already taken place, but now you started to have the Eastern European expansion, the British comeback, and that's really been taking hold in the last few years, and the Asian fighters now. You look at a lot of the Asian world titleists, particularly in Japan, Thailand, countries like that, a lot of them have WBO titles. So that's how the WBO has gained credibility. It's in those markets with those champions as fighters from those parts of the world started to really hit the main stage and become very, very competitive in the current global boxing landscape. It's never been more global than it is right now. Okay, so now I'm going to do a quick comparison of the number of champions of each sanctioning organization. And to me, this tells you where their hearts and minds are. And let's start with the two newest organizations that have the fewest amount of champions. Now look, There's 17 divisions in boxing right now, 17 divisions. You guys know I hate that. I think it's too many. But it's bad enough that we've got 17 divisions. But the WBC and the WBA have multiple divisions or multiple champions in each division. But when we look at the WBO, they have 16 champions right now. And junior middleweight is vacant. So you got to give them some credit for that one. They don't have that many champions. They have about as many as is allowed in boxing right now. IBF, pretty much the same thing. They have a champion in all 17 divisions, and they have one interim champion right now. So as far as not passing out titles like candy and honoring mandatories and stuff like that, the IBF and the WBO seem to do the best. I think the IBF follows their rules the best out of all four. Consistently, but even they break their rules sometimes. So, okay, the WBC, and again, there's 17 divisions. They have champions in 16 of them. Right now, I believe the super middleweight division is vacant because Badu Jack moved up in weight to light heavyweight, right? They have 12 silver champions. They have 14 international champions, and they have one diamond champion. So, try making sense of that. Let me, off the top of my head, let's see, 16, that's 30, 42. That's 43 champions at the time I'm recording this. 43 champions, world champions, or oh no, some of these are international, sorry, that the WBC has. Try explaining that to your casual boxing friends. Not easy, right? But the WBA is by far the worst. Right now, the WBA, in the 17 divisions that we have in professional boxing, they have 15 regular champions, 9 super champions, 4 interim champions, 2 undisputed champions, 1 unified champion, 10 Latin American champions, 9 North American, 6 Pan-African, 6 continental, 6 intercontinental, and 4 Oceania champions. I'm not even going to try to add that shit up right now. That is too fucking many. The WBA is by far the worst of the 4 sanctioning organizations in this regard. In fact, they are a laughing stock. They are a running joke among diehard boxing fans. Keep in mind, guys, all of those titles are not free. They come with a sanctioning fee. Some more than others. Obviously, if you're a super undisputed unified champion, you're paying more than the Oceania champion's paying. But still, you're paying a portion of your purse to the WBA to get that title. So start doing the math on all that, and you see which is the greediest. The WBC is the greedy. The WBA is even more so. Those two are the worst, but the WBA is by far the worst of the lot. All right, a couple quick thoughts here, and then I'll close this thing off. It's easy to beat up on the sanctioning bodies. It's really easy to beat up on them. There's a ton of stuff. I mean, this video could be 5 hours long, and I could talk about examples of corruption or favoritism, all kinds of things, right? In all of them, literally all of them. But they're a necessary evil. Without the sanctioning organizations, think back to a lot of the mandatory fights that have been made over the years where a guy that would never get a fair shake worked his way into a mandatory position and because of that was able to do something in his career. You could even look at a guy like Julius Ndongo is a good example where he was an opponent against Edward Troyanovsky and won by knockout. He wasn't going to win a decision in Russia, right? But he won by knockout. And that title that he took from that fight, that sanctioning organization title, booked his ticket to the UK to get a crack at Ricky Burns. And again, he took advantage of that situation. Now he has 2 titles. And that booked his ticket to Nebraska for his fight against Terrence Crawford, where he's going to make over $1 million. He would have never, ever made anywhere near $1 million without those title belts. So they are a necessary evil, and there are times where they lead to feel-good stories like a Julius Ndongo, who because of those 2 world titles is going to make 7 figures, would have never made that without the titles. Maybe would have never made 6 figures without those titles. So, you know, there's good and there's bad. I can beat up on the WBC because I see them directly and indirectly paying media outlets here in Los Angeles to cover fights. I see them do it all the time. There are particular media outlets that are basically a PR group for the WBC and WBC related fighters. I see it all the time. The WBC will never pass on an opportunity to interject themselves into a big fight to promote themselves. You look at when Canelo Alvarez fought Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. earlier this year. There was no title on the line, but the BC made some stupid title belt just so they could be part of it. They had nothing to do with that fight. They contributed nothing to it. And by the way, Canelo Alvarez is mad at the BC. You guys know the situation. I don't need to go all into it with Miguel Cotto when he won the fight, and then Gennady Golovkin was a mandatory. And I think, this is just me guessing. I can only guess, right? But based on everything I've heard and everything I know, I think Canelo was ultimately pissed off with the WBC because they pretty much didn't give him special treatment. I think he expected special treatment from them because they've done it so many times for, as I said, star fighters and particularly Mexican fighters, and he's both. So when the WBC actually made him or forced him to either fight Golovkin or be stripped, I think the WBC would have bent the rules for him, but Tom Loeffler at K2 Promotions, the man knows law. And he had that mandatory position with his fighter, with the BC. And I talked to you guys before about the Roy Jones, Rocco Gianni thing. And they almost went bankrupt, the WBC did. They were not going to put themselves in a situation like that again. So they kind of forced Canelo's hand. And because he didn't get special treatment, he kind of told the WBC to go fuck themselves. Now, I understand Canelo's point of view to a degree, but I understand the WBC's point to a degree. But you look at the fight between Canelo and Chavez, and again, the WBC making one of these Hoichol belts, and I'm probably not even saying that word right. They had nothing to do with that fight. But because it was such a big event with Mexican-American and Mexican fans, they had to make themselves a part of it. That's one of the things about the WBC I can't stand. And they are the worst when it comes to that. When it comes to butting in and interjecting themselves into events that have nothing to do with them. That's the whole point of the diamond belt and all this. They have put themselves in catchweight fights before with these special titles just so they can collect a sanctioning fee. It's the stupidest thing ever. Even if they're not getting a sanctioning fee, it's just so the WBC can get a little bit of PR in a massive event. It's stupid. It's unnecessary. And that's why I don't like them. And I know some of the people that work loosely through the media institutions that they kind of fund. And it's not like they're putting up a ton of money. It's little trinkets here and there. And these guys do a great job, and I love them. They're wonderful people. But I can't be a part of those media outlets because you're working kind of indirectly, kind of directly even, with the WBC. That's a conflict of interest I can't get with. I say all that, and then the WBC has put up money before for the Henry Armstrong Foundation here in Los Angeles during the Martin Luther King, the Kingdom Day Parade, which I volunteer for. And I've been on the Henry Armstrong Parade float with a bunch of WBC boxers. They bring out boxers and they put up like $1,000 to help the Henry Armstrong Foundation build the float. Now the float costs like $5,000 or $6,000. The WBC ain't gonna put up that much. It's a tiny little $1,000 chunk, and yeah, it's a tax write-off for them. They're just giving a little bit, but it still counts. So of all the bad things I could say about the BC, I could say some good things too, right? The WBA, I can beat up on them for hours. I can't stand their title structure, the way they just hand out belts. I think it's disgusting. But you look at a situation like earlier this year with Ryota Murata and Hassam Nadam, where Murata was just flat out robbed against Nadam, right? Now, the WBA didn't go as far as to strip Nadam of their title and turn the fight into a no contest or something like that. They didn't do that, but they demanded an immediate rematch. So now Murata will have a chance at justice in this next fight. They've also suspended judges before. They've suspended judges multiple times, and they've suspended fighters. Shannon Briggs was supposed to fight for one of the versions of their billion versions of the heavyweight title they had, but he got busted for performance-enhancing drugs. Gee, big shock. And they suspended Briggs. So the WBA does some good things as well. I could say the same thing about the IBF. I could say the same thing about the WBO. So guys, it's a mixed bag. In the end, it's a mixed bag of good and bad. But when you look at these four groups, the two classic or older ones, if there's any distinction between the four of them, okay? The two classic ones are the WBC and WBA. The new kids on the block who came around literally within 5 years of each other in the 80s is the IBF, WBO. You can think of the WBA as a very Latin American-based organization. You can think of the WBC as a heavily Mexican/North American influenced organization. The IBF, heavily American influenced. And the WBO, I would call the European/Asian influenced sanctioning organization. So in that regard, you can kind of get a picture in your mind of where they all kind of fit in. Now, as far as how I rate the titles, like which title means more than the other, I could give a flying fuck. There are instances where the WBO titleist is just a better fighter than the WBC titleist, right? Some fans out there are like, well, fuck the WBO. I only roll with the green belt, the WBC. That's dumb. Guys, none of these titles. I talked about what they can do in a good way for a fighter. Julius Ndongo example. I talked about that. But it's not about who has the titles. It's about who's the best damn fighter in each division. And you can go to boxing publications that actually tell the truth about this stuff. You know, I talked about Ring Magazine. I'm partial to Boxing Monthly magazine myself because I'm biased. But we tell the truth. We have our own ratings. Here at Boxing Monthly, we have UK ratings because it's a UK magazine, and then there's world ratings. Ring Magazine has a championship policy that I think is a better policy than any of the sanctioning organizations. Even an entity like ESPN, their ratings are better than any of these sanctioning organization ratings. No one's paying Boxing Monthly, Ring Magazine, ESPN for their rating. Nobody. There's no sanctioning fee. There's no money involved. So in that regard, go to the news outlets. Don't go to some of these whack, biased YouTube idiots who have an agenda. Make sure you're going to a quality outlet, a publication that's been around for a few decades and actually knows what they're talking about. But that's where you go to find out who the best fighters are. It doesn't matter who has these damn belts. But now you know a little bit more about the history of the sanctioning organizations. Hopefully, I didn't bore you to death. Guys, thank you for supporting the channel. Please like this video, share it, subscribe. I'll see you at the fights.